Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name is Tamara Falikoff. I'm so happy to be here hosting a program that's the brainchild of the Latinx research group from KUMC, KU Medical Center, that also works with KU Lawrence, where I am. And the idea is that we explore Henry Louis Gates's seminal PBS series called Black in Latin America. We've so far shown 2 episodes, the one on Brazil, and the first one we screened was on Haiti, Dominican Republic. So this is our penultimate film about Cuba, the role of Afro-Cubanidad in terms of national culture and history. And Henry Louis Gates is a historian who's written a book actually called Black in Latin America, published by NYU Press. Now, the series was produced in 2011, so it's been a decade since that series was aired. So what's really lovely about this series or this program is that we're going to put the link to the film in the chat here on Zoom for you to see on your own. It's about 52 minutes. And Alexa, our digital docent, is going to be doing that for all of you who want to watch the film. And then the idea is that we're going to come back and discuss some of the issues that the film brings up. So we'll use that as a basis, but really the key point of this program is to introduce 2 of our speakers who both were born in Cuba, were raised there, went to university there, and now live here. And so let me do those introductions, and then I'm going to be asking them questions after we watch the film together, and then there'll be time for all of us to talk about some of the issues the film raises. So let me begin. I'd like to introduce Yasmin Portales Machado. She's a PhD student from Northwestern University in the Spanish and Portuguese department. Her research examines the ways in which science fiction depicts politics, sexualities, and families in Spanish Caribbean literature. She's particularly interested in studying Cuban cyberpunk and Cuban female science fiction writers such as Anibel Enriquez and Diana Chaviano. And then we also have Ernesto Suarez, who is an account branch manager at Unity One Credit Union and co-founder of Ariel Media. He's a writer, an activist, and a translator. And I'm really grateful to both Ernesto and Yasmin for agreeing to be here today to speak with us. So Alexa is going to put the link to the film in the chat. And I'm really happy that those of you who are here, Mira, Jeffrey, Marta, will please come back after screening the movie, and maybe there'll be more people, and we're going to talk about the history of Cuba and the role that African descended people play in everyday life. And again, to have these 2 with us, we're going to talk about the present. What is it like now? How does race play into politics and culture compared to the US? So we're going to do a comparative look as well. All right, so as you can see in the link, here is, actually we're going to come back at 7:15, not 7:45. I know, no big deal, Alexa. So we're going to, exactly, thank you, Yasmin, you caught it too. So we have about an hour, give or take, to come back. We'll be here, it's 6:10 right now. We'll come back at 7:15, as we had said before, so we have about 30 minutes. And we'll reconvene and go from there. So enjoy. Me parece muy buena la peli, but you all can decide. And there may be some omissions. There may be some different ways of seeing the world. And that's why we're going to come and look at it critically and talk some more. So we can turn off our cameras now, turn off our audio, and click on the link. And we will see you back at 7:15. Thank you so much. But it will wait 1 more minute until we are all ready to begin. Hey, Jaime, that we all know who is speaking, and then we'll open up the floor to have a generalized discussion. So welcome back to those who were here earlier. Welcome to those who are new. My name is Tamara Falikoff. I'm at KU Lawrence in Film and Media Studies and Latin American and Caribbean Studies. And I want to introduce two speakers that are here with us. Ernesto Suarez, who is an account branch manager at Unity One Credit Union and co-founder of Ariel Media. Ernesto is a writer, activist, and translator, and he's here locally in Kansas City. And then we have Yasmin Portales Machado, who is a PhD student at Northwestern University in the Spanish and Portuguese department. So she is in the Evanston, Illinois area. And both of them are Cuban, and they grew up there and went to university there. So without further ado, I hope you got a chance to watch the film. I'm going to be drawing from it, but I know some of you in the audience are Cuban or Cuban American, and so you'll also have different perspectives. But I want to begin by talking about a point that Miguel Barnett brings up in the film, where he regards that that now contributions of African descended Cubans are being taught in elementary through high school, and that this is something new and it's something that's overdue. And so I wanted to ask, I'll start with Yasmin, you know, how was it growing up in Cuba through elementary and university? What were the contributions of Afro-Cubans, if at all? Could you speak to kind of the inclusion of this community as part of Comunidad, but was it present? Was it absent? What are your thoughts?
I think it's difficult to assess how the African legacy of the Cuban culture was teach to me, because it happened some time ago, not that long, but some time ago. But basically because, okay, I'm afraid that I will be critical in a way I could not be when that was happening, because I was a child, first of all. And second, it always feel it. I always receive the impression that the Black people that mean in Cuban history were few, and definitely in some way white. And what happened with Antonio Maceo's skull has described in the documentary is kind of the point, right? He was a mulatto. He was not, at least when I was teach about him in the 80s and the 90s and the beginning of the 21st century, he was not a Black man. He was a mulatto. There were like Flor Crombet was a Black man, Quintin Banderas was a Black man, but the Maceo family was a mulatto family. And that was kind of the destiny, the mulatto elite to lead the country, and then the patriotic Black leaders will die some way or another in a very sad way.
Interesting. Ernesto, do you want to add to that? Or
Oh, absolutely. One of the things that she mentions is, and it's not mentioned in the documentary, is that Cuban society has not only been racist, but has also been colorist. And that continues to today. I mean, there is a very stark distinction between mulatto and Black, and then everything between mulatto and what's considered white. You know, we have, I don't know, some 20 different categories of people, depending on the shade of their skin and depending on their mix. So that's something that was not mentioned in the documentary, that it is very important, because even within the Black Cuban community, as it is here as well, there are those distinctions between how dark you are, how different your hair is, how good your hair is, how bad your hair is, the color of your gums, things like that. It's very colorist. There's no other way for it, But as she mentions, yeah, there was not really a very distinctive way of teaching the contributions of Black people to Cuban history. These were Cuban, and
Right.
it falls within that Cubanidad, which has some positive uh, aspects to it, but it also sort of erases the fact that these people had to overcome not only the, their, in many cases, poor origins, but also the color barrier to get to where they were. And it would have added a different dimension to their fight. Mostly, the darker ones, again, the Black ones, Quintin Banderas, Flu Crombet, people that were really maybe the children of slaves or the descendants of slaves, something that the documentary doesn't mention either, which is something that was not really taught in Cuba as well. It's the fact that, yes, the African presence in Cuba increased dramatically at the beginning of the 19th century, but there had been an African presence in Cuba since the 16th century, 100 years before Africans were brought to North America. There was an African presence in Cuba. And in many cases, they were slaves, but they're also free people. And they also contributed a lot to Cuban culture, as recorded by Fernando Ortiz, a white ethnographer from the 1940s, but who actually contributed a lot to the history of Afro-Cuban evolution and contributions to Cuban culture and history in Cuba, and through whom we've actually gotten to know a lot. Now, that wasn't taught in elementary school. That wasn't taught in, this are things that I had to go out of my way to find out. And in some cases, I had to come here. I had to learn these things when I was already living in the US. So it's very limited the way that it is taught. Again, it is all within that framework of Cubanidad. We're all Cuban, doesn't matter what color you are, where your family is, don't need tu abuela donde está, it doesn't matter. So
well, that's a good segue to my next question, which did come up. Henry Louis Gates in the documentary says, I find it interesting being in Cuba and asking Black people, are you Black? How do you identify? And they say, 100% Cubano. I'm 100% Cuban and I am Black. Whereas he says in the US, it's the opposite. People are like, I'm a Black person and I'm an American. And so what I wanted to talk about a little bit is this idea of nationalism, Cuban nationalism, which is absolutely pervasive throughout the revolution. There's this whole idea of like, we are all Cuban, as you were saying, Ernesto. But it's also problematic because if Castro said in 1962, we're eradicating racism under socialism, then if you're to speak up out and say this is racist, then you are counter-revolutionary, right? So it becomes extremely fraught when there's no space within the revolution to be, let's face it, critical. I mean, we can debate this, but that's what I've been reading, is that this issue of race is tricky. And as you were saying, Ernesto, there's a whole history prior to that that had, it's slowly being acknowledged, but it's almost like saying, oh, everybody's colorblind in the US. Race doesn't matter. Of course it does, So Yasmin, do you want to speak to this question of nationalism and these kinds of questions and identification? I mean, and again, if you don't mind speaking about your experiences in Cuba, because again, it shifts when you come to this country. The race is also very complicated here too. So.
There was never doubt in my mind that the issue of the erasure, if we want to put it in a negative way, the erasure of the race inequality, of the racial, of the structural racism of Cuban culture in name of the national unity predates by long the revolution. It's a problem that I think that the documentary refers to in a tangential way. It's a problem that predates independence and the republic. It's related to the discursive and political strategies that the Cuban independent movement developed to oppose the cultural discourse of the Spanish metropolitan powers. Like the IT revolution effect along the whole world had yet to be fairly assessed. But we can certainly say that in Cuba, it became the boogeyman.
The Haitian Revolution was the boogeyman, for sure.
Yeah,
good point.
For the good white people that fear God and Black freedom. So, and there was a great production, a big deal of production of propaganda demonizing what Black rebels had done to the white population, to good French colonizers in Haiti, and that will certainly happen in Cuba if these people became free. So I can understand how the Cuban national elites were deeply invested in to deny that difference within the Cuban nation in order to ensure the participation of the white middle class and poor population in the independent project. So that cemented practice of put nation and national identity first and ethnicity of any kind after. We are not, I mean, for me, growing up and watching American movies, it was very strange. I remember watching The Good Father, for example, and being unable to understand why in the second movie and in the third, I remember, I could not understand why these people keep calling themselves Italians. They are not Italians. Michael Corleone born in New York. What the hell, they are American. But they keep calling themselves Italian. And you can see that also with the Irish community and St. Patrick. What the hell, what they are celebrating St. Patrick? They are not Irish, they are American. And, and it happened, and that obsession with genealogy and my ancestor that live in a different country, which language I don't speak anymore, is completely absurd for me as a Cuban. I am a Cuban. My ancestors, I'm very aware of that, were probably driven by force in some stinky ship. But that doesn't matter. My history, my cultural history starts in this island. It doesn't exist outside of the island, you know? And I think that makes the racial issue more complicated to address within the Cuban logic of things, because we are so obsessed with the idea of national unity, well, you know, that
yeah.
thing.
Unity, yeah.
Yeah, that this had become the logical excuse to forbid health and honest discussions about the racism within the Cuban society and culture.
Thank you.
It's not something that started, definitely, it did not start in 1959.
Okay, thank you for that. I stand corrected and I appreciate it. That's a good point. I'm going to ask one more question to both of them, and then I'm going to open this up for discussion. And I want to bring in the US because we're fortunate to have both of you here as well. And you've, Ernesto, how many years? You came here in 95, is that right?
That's correct, yeah, 1995.
And what? And Yasmin, how long have you been in the US?
You're on mute.
Oh yeah, you're on mute, sorry. I thought you were just thinking.
I was thinking too. 16, 2000, yeah, September 2016.
Okay. So Ernesto's been here a little longer. I'm just curious if there's a way you can speak about this question of race being in two different contexts, and it's going to be different for each of you for obvious reasons.
Right.
But could you help us understand, since most of us haven't spent a lot of time in Cuba, I'll just say, Marta Caminero, who's here with us, her family is Cuban. She was born here. No, you were born in Cuba? Okay, well, I stand
Canada.
corrected. You were born in Canada. I'm sorry. Okay.
Eh,
So, and I'm the child of Argentine immigrants. Okay, so that's why we know this about each other. But anyway, could you each of you speak a little bit about how you kind of see race here? And you touched on this a little bit, this issue of race relations, especially Blackness in the US versus being a Black Cuban. I mean, I love what you were just saying, Yasmin, watching, Goodfellas, watching The Godfather, these movies, and not understanding the hyphen. And I will
Yeah.
just say in Argentina, I was in a taxi cab. It was called a remis, and there was a little magnet that had these little Hebrew letters on it. And I was like, oh, it's Hebrew, and it was like Baruch Hashem. It was some little like religious Jewish thing on the taxi cab. And I said, oh, interesting, to the cabbie, and he goes, yeah, he owns the cab company, but he's Argentine. He's Argentine. And I'm like, well, yeah, he's Jewish Argentine, whatever. That's what I am. Big deal. But no, he's Argentine. It's like, oh, got it. Loud and clear. So this hyphen is an issue, maybe in a lot of Latin America, not just Cuba,
Absolutely.
at least in Argentina. So go ahead, Ernesto.
It's something that I've wrestled with since I came here. I mean, 25 years, and I still have a hard time understanding the hyphen. You have to first get used to the idea that, first of all, I look white, although if I show you my DNA composition, that's a completely different story. I always try to say that my DNA story tells the history of Cuba, because I'm really everything. I'm Chinese, I'm Spaniard, I'm Black, I'm Middle Eastern, I'm Jewish, and I'm Portuguese, I'm Italian, I'm pretty much everyone that came through that island made me who I am. But coming here, I first of all realized that I'm considered a different race, and that race in the US means something different. Race in the US means ethnicity and identity, which is different. Because race somewhere else, it doesn't necessarily mean identity. It means just the way you look. And then there are all these hyphens, as she was pointing out, all these hyphenated identities that don't really have much to do with what the second word actually means, or the first word, Italian American, Irish American, just like she said, it's very difficult and different for us to see that, because in Cuba, I've met people whose last names were, German or Italian or even Irish, and there were quite a few, of course, Jewish Cubans. Most of them came from Eastern Europe, but we also had some from the Middle East. We had actually quite a few Lebanese and Syrian people, and they were all Cuban after the second generation. Yeah, your parents were Syrian. Yeah, your grandparents were from, I don't know, Valencia, like Jaime. But you are Cuban. You were born here. You don't speak the language. You don't have a strong cultural link to them. You eat the same things that we do. You, except the Jewish ones. You sing the same songs, to dance to the same music. You use the same cuss words. How are you not Cuban? And in that sense, it's just wrestling with that. How are you not American? How do you consider yourself something else when you're just this? And I think that was that first shock. And then the other one is this heightened, in our view, sense of race in America, this division that Black people are sort of a separate culture. from the rest of the country, that African American means really to be different. That is another way of otherizing a part of the population. That, and and unfortunately it goes both ways in some cases, and at least from my perspective, and perhaps from Jasmine's perspective as well. It's been very difficult. It's been very different because we come from that homogenized society where we are all Cuban, where we are not really the same. Let's not hide the fact that there is racism in Cuba, because there is, and again, colorism and all that stuff. But the way of looking at it is different. You know, here we acknowledge it all the time. We talk about it a lot. We constantly talk about it. Whether we do something about it or not, that's different, but we talk about it a lot. And that was not the case in Cuba. You know, it was there, it was mentioned once in a while, somebody would say something. And again, you know, it was not something that you should say in many cases or acknowledge. But here is all, you know, it's a constant conversation. And it is also very curious for some of us with a more historically minded mind frame that, you know, slavery in this country was abolished 16 years before or longer than in Cuba, you know, almost 20 years. So it's curious to us that conversation is still ongoing in this country. Of course, once you understand the reasons and you read the history and you learn the history, it becomes a little bit clearer. But at first, it's very shocking that, you know, so many years later, we're still having these conversations. So yeah, that was my impression. I mean, there's a lot more, of course, having to do with you know, the Hispanic community and whatnot, but I would love to hear Jasmine's perspective.
For me, it was, the thing is that is shocking for me is that, like Ernesto said, that in the United States, at these liberal circles and, you know, social activist circles, race is an issue that is spoke a lot, but haven't changed in a very long time in the big picture along the United States. It's like I remember reading Malcolm X autobiography when I was a teenager and arrived to Chicago and realized that things haven't changed that much. I mean, technologically, they had changed, but in many cases, the practices and the kind of predestined fate of a Black kid in a dysfunctional family, throw into the social system care, it kind of could be pretty much all that Malcolm X happened before he became a Muslim and a social activist, like drug trafficking, pimp, whatever. So in contrast with Cuba, where we don't, for the most part of my life, race was not something that was spoke about. Like the conversations, I think, started pretty much when Luis made the documentary around 2010 and reached a peak in 2012. Roberto Urbano, one of the intellectuals that show up in the documentary, said later that the year 12 is bad for Black Cubans. 8,000, 1812, 1912 and 2012 were very, very bad years for the Cuban, for the Black Cubans, were in different ways. But the conversation had just started. And part of the reason why the conversation basically stopped in 1940 with the Constitution and was kind of forbid in 1960 and show up in 2012 was because, in theory, the economic basis of racial inequality had been addressed. What did not reach the discourse or did not permeate or did not reflect in the education or the discourse about, Cuban history did have a small, I think that a small but a certain reflex in public policies, because all the Cuban population achieved a capacity of economic progress during the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s that reflect too in the Black community. People who were able to go to school. I mean, people was able to send their kids to school to have a job that will pay the bills. There were aspirations for many people that happened of having a house in a good neighborhood, all that kind of thing that code social mobility in the traditional concept happened to a large part of the Cuban population, and that large part included Black Cubans. The problem was when the 90s arrived and the crisis happened, and suddenly that illusion of equality crumbled. And we realized that because that economic progress had not been, didn't have correlate with cultural analysis and direct interventions in certain part of society, some people keep thriving and others stayed the same or went back. And a large part of the people that stay or went back were Black. So
Thank
of
you
course,
so much for that. I would love for us to keep talking. I'm just super sad because there are only about 3 more minutes, but I think we should go a little bit more because people haven't had a chance to ask questions. I mean, you can tell that Yasmin and Ernesto know so much, but you all might want to tell your own stories or ask questions about these topics. And if you don't mind sticking around, maybe we could go 10 more minutes just to have a conversation, because that's one of the beauties of this kind of a format. Who would like to chime in? Questions? Should I call on somebody? No. Okay, Mira, perfect.
Okay, so thank you everybody so much. This is very enlightening and illuminating. My question has to do with the end of the documentary when they do the short interview with the rapper. And it's about his songs that address racism and the fact that they really should not be performing these songs because it will put the whole concert in jeopardy. And so if racism is just starting to be talked about in Cuba around this time, I'm wondering how that has changed, if at all, since that time in terms of music and being able to address things head on. Thank you.
So sorry, Jasmine, quick. So I actually have been worked on a project last summer about precisely this topic of culture and race. And I was actually working on a translation for a friend that wrote a paper about this. And there have been, with the arrival of new technologies, cell phones, whatnot, I think there has been an underground proliferation of this sort of music, but it's still underground. There are some forms of recognized rap or reggaeton, which is similar in Cuba, but they have to be approved unofficial lyrics. Anyone that addresses, let's begin with the fact that dissent is not allowed, even small amount of dissent, and this is considered dissent. To talk about race in Cuba is considered dissent. And let's look at the case of what happened on November 27th of last year, which is just 3 months ago. A group of Cuban artists, mostly Black, known as the San Isidro movement, San Isidro being an old, mostly Black, very poor, old neighborhood in Havana. These artists that decided to go on a hunger strike there just because they wanted a little bit more of freedom of expression. They were not even talking about overthrowing the regime. They were just talking about being able to express their ideas and their creativity in the way that they see fit and that fits their needs and their drives. And it became a huge issue. I mean, it escalated into these people being arrested, the police breaking in, getting them. So nothing has really changed. Now, I always say that Cuba is the place where everything changes from one day to another, and yet everything stays exactly the same. You never know what new law is going to be tomorrow. You never know what the new stipulation is going to be tomorrow, but it's still going to be the same. It is going to continue that, as they call it now, continuidad, which tells you everything. It's continuity. That's the new slogan. We're going to continue doing whatever we've been doing for the past 62 years, because look how well that's worked. So no, in my opinion, and I don't live there, but I have still family there, and I'm really in touch with a lot of people who are part of this movement, and and so on and so forth. And no, nothing has changed. Nothing has evolved. The conversation about race is a very academic conversation. Yes, there is a group of academics that go into fora and go out, and that's a way for them to travel, and that's a way for the government to show that there is some sort of dialogue, but it's not really happening. It is a very academic, it's all for show. There's no substance to it. Nothing has changed. Nothing will change because it doesn't fit their internal narrative. And even when they go out, even when these academics go out and talk about their experiences, they have to toe the line. This is what is approved. We can talk about what happened before, but we cannot talk about what happened now. We can talk about the spaces that we've gained, but we cannot talk about the spaces that we've lost, or the spaces that we never achieved, or the spaces that we never reached, or the freedom that we never got. It's the same, and it's been the same for the past 60 years. At some point, as the documentary said, at some point in the 1920s, for example, it was illegal in Cuba to practice Santeria or to do, to foster certain types of music. And that's changed. But then the new regime had realized that this was a way to show cultural diversity. And, since the 1970s, there have been a huge amount of what they call folkloric groups and dances that tour and show that part of Cuban heritage and history. But these people go back, in many cases, go back to live in the same slums that they grew up. I grew up in the slums. I grew up in a very poor neighborhood where a lot of people were Black and very poor and very marginal and this happened in the 80s and it happened before. There's certain, as she said, there was a certain improvement, but it wasn't across the board and it wasn't for everyone. And we're not allowed to talk about that. And no one is least talk about the fact that Black people, even at that time, were the least, who benefited the least of this. And they were still considered suspects, and they were considered non. It's a huge problem, and one that has not changed, and they're not going to talk about it.
Yasmin, do you want to add anything? Or Jaime? Well, let's see if Yasmin wants to speak, or if you want to let Jaime go. What do you want us to do? Next. Okay.
Should I go? Thank you.
Yes.
Well, first of all, thank you, Ernesto, Tamara, and Jasmine for the great session. I'm learning so much from you all, so I really appreciate it. I had one comment and two questions, but I don't know that we got enough time, so I'll just throw them out and you guys respond whatever you can. So one of my comments is the author of these documentaries. I really love the documentary, but one little thing that bothers me is that he keeps calling the United States America while he is in America, and that's something that really bothers me. It's silly and small, but you know, I wanted to make the point. I wanted to ask about the one of the questions, intersectionality between being racialized as a Black person in Cuba, but also by gender or other intersectionalities. And then my second question was, is there any equivalent to Ebonics accent in Cuba? Because to me, that's it's my understanding that that's a sign of segregation, right? As far as I'm not a linguist, but that's what I think. I've heard from other people. So thank you.
What accent?
Ebonics. Ebonics would be an accent that's most common among Black people.
Ah,
It's like a vernacular, you know, which is hard if you think about Cuban Spanish, right? Because isn't it so Caribbeanized? And so I don't
But
know.
yes, there is
Right?
one.
So, there is one though? Okay.
And it's mostly something that has been popularized and it's basically the way that people in Havana speak and the way that they speak in the slums and in the poor neighborhoods. And that is where we got it from. Now, there are other ways as well, because, and I have to make, you know, a little bit of history, sorry. As opposed to many other places where slavery was present, the Spaniards did not care at all for the slaves in Cuba. They did not care to teach them the language. They did not care to, even, they cared so little that they were not even, they didn't even care to impose their religion on most of the slaves. So therefore a lot of them kept their language, their original languages from Africa. So we have a lot of words that come directly from West Africa that are used in Cuban speak. And mostly there is a sect that is called Abaqua, which is an older sect that actually more or less is contemporary with that large influx of West Africans that came to that were brought to Cuba in the early 1800s, that does have its own language. And it's a secret code because it was a secret society. But the funny part is that 70% of them at some point were actually white Spaniards from Galicia that adopted this language and somehow made it popular. So there you go.
Fascinating. Other questions, or if, yes, Jasmine, you want to say anything?
here's the thing with discrimination. You don't realize in many occasions that you're a victim until someone pointed out to you. So I remember being unable to understand why I should be offended when people call me the equivalent of the N word in Cuban Spanish, because it was not something that I was ashamed of or worried about. But my mother was able to tell when someone was saying it in a racist manner. Or remember my grandfather explaining to me, you should not say N-word, you should say colored people. That became a joke, a recurring joke in my family. I asked him, where are the transparent people? Because everyone has a color, right? Like, So, but I do realize it very soon that it was more important for me as an individual that I was a female that I was a Black female, because my family was deeply invested in my education and in support me and in make me aware of the roadblocks that I will have to overcome because I was a Black person in Cuba. But still don't know why they didn't tell me that to be a woman was also a problem. I have to find out that by my own. When people start to tell me, you cannot do this, you can go to that game, you cannot practice that science, you are not supposed to be good in math. It's not a problem. You're not good in math. It doesn't matter. You're a girl. Like, I'm supposed to have, A because I'm Black. No, but you're a girl, so you don't have to have an A in math. That's kind of
Thank you so much to the two of you. Thank you.
I mean, yeah, and if you want to add, sexual orientation to that as well, that's very difficult because it is even worse for the people who are Black, because there is actually this stereotype that Black men are not gay, and that happens here too, and that if you're gay and Black, that is, as they say in Cuba, that's double. They threw double shit on you. That's the way that it translates. I mean, you got the worst end of the stick, and so it's even worse when that gets thrown into it. And it's the same for women, and trans women. I have a trans Black friend in Cuba who is going through a lot right now because she is overcoming that a lot of issues around the fact of coming from a mixed home, first of all, being a trans woman, being also a person that doesn't, per se, agree with everything that the regime says or does. So there, of course, there are different dimensions to oppression and discrimination in Cuba when you bring in those elements.
Ernesto, can you tell us in Spanish what the phrase is? I just want to know, just curious.
A ti te cayó toda la mierda. Yeah.
Any other questions for Jasmine and Ernesto? Well, this was really, really illuminating. We have Alexa putting in the chat to please give us some feedback. We want to keep this kind of programming. We think it's useful for everybody, especially medical students who are working with lots of different people, but humanities and arts, it's always important. I mean, that's what we do in the humanities and arts. And I really appreciate you being here. I know there were multiple programs happening tonight, and you showed up and you watched the film and you asked really, really great, compelling questions. And I have to say, Ernesto and Yasmin hit the ball out of the park. You had some fantastic forms of analysis. You've been thinking a lot about this, and we're so grateful that you could share this with us. And I just, thank you for coming. And we're going to do one more in April. Yeah, let's thank them. Thank you, Jaime. Absolutely, you guys rock. We're going to do one more screening, and it's focused on Mexican and Peruvian, the two countries, Mexico and Peru. And so that will be in April. And I'm sad that we're moving along so quickly because we can critique the films, but I think they're really good springboards to look at history and to look at the now and all the different ways that we can see this culturally. So thanks again to the two speakers, and thank you all for being here, and have a wonderful evening. Take care, everybody.